In the live sessions of Future Summit 2021, we had a very interesting conversation earlier on with Linda Zeilina from the International Sustainable Finance Center, and we talked about sustainable finance, sustainable investment, and circularity, and especially about the future. And we meet with Mircea Iliescu from the University of Cambridge to talk again about the future, but from a sort of a different perspective, if you like. And just want to take this opportunity to also tell you a bit about what happened so far and what happens in the next hours. So at this point, as you know, we are just let me take this out. We're sort of midday. We go to Athens later on to talk about assistive technology, in particular tech for the blind. And then in the evening, we have two sessions on sustainable business making and sustainable finance. Besides that, what happens tomorrow is a really, really cool and interesting day. From the final part of Introduction to Sustainability and the first part of Introduction to Innovation, we go then to Berlin to talk to Tanja Schindler on how to use foresight in business. We talk about risk education, and special moment from 2 o'clock. We have the Future Makers pitches. These are 22 startups in our incubator from 6 countries coming to some extent change the future. Now, we are here with Mircea, and I'm very excited about this conversation. This is a particularly interesting topic and exciting topic for me. A couple of things about Mircea. He has a PhD, and let me just read this so that I don't mix it. Human Evolutionary Genetics. I mean, just this title is enough for any conversation. From Cambridge in 2016. He's currently a tutor and course director for evolutionary biology. He is fascinated by human diversity and focused on the study of the evolution of human genetic diversity in world populations. Now, that's a very long introduction, and it could have made it shorter, but it's not to be made short. Hi, Mircea. Welcome to Future Summit.
Hi, Giulian. Thank you for having me. Greetings to your viewers and listeners, to our viewers.
Thank you. We have hundreds of participants from all over the world that will also join us later in the, to some extent, recorded session. And I want to say hello to some of our viewers that will jump on later from, let me read this, Mexico, Colombia, Canada, and Singapore. These are some countries where some of our participants are from. Now, speaking of these many countries, I cannot stop but wonder. You are passionate about human evolution. So I would just, it's a very simple question: is why are you passionate about that? And then we go deeper into, designing babies and stuff like this.
Yeah, design babies. Greetings from Cambridge to everyone. From quite a sunny day today. Temperature not too bad, as the British say. So I've always been interested in why we're different. I guess many of us are interested in that from different perspectives and different angles. I see during this summit you talk out about finance, technology. I mean, I think when I started school, the idea of biology and technology was not really, especially in Romania, we were not really thinking about technology and biology. Biology was in a way quite old-fashioned. Once I arrived in the UK to continue my studies, I discovered quite a new world where genetics and biology were basically at the forefront of innovation, and that continued. If I think back to the years 2000, the knots, how do you say it? Even then, in our labs here, we were doing things that we're not doing now anymore. That things have moved on massively. Myself, I was just always interested in humans, in nature, and in why we're different. And I guess I found this angle of looking at our genetics and at our evolutionary history. So where do we come from? and what makes us different, what explains our biological differences.
Yeah. I have a subsequent question which comes which says, I mean, I understand that we're very different, but what are some of the things that make us identical or
Yes,
very similar?
when we talk about differences, there always are similarities. So I think when we try to understand why we're different, then the question comes, what is our common origin and what unites us? I mean, we know many things unite us. I wouldn't want to go into the more philosophical, and I think lots of specialists in these fields could say much more. But from a biological point of view, we are almost identical. We're 99 point something genetically identical. So we have many things that we share. We share the ability to think, to have a language, to walk. So we could go on and on. So there's many things that unite us. And then, of course, the question comes, but what about our differences? Where do they come from? Differences that, in a way, we celebrate and we find them particularly interesting and yeah, a reason for celebration. It's just whenever I look around, I'm just fascinated to see diversity. And I guess that's the same with all sorts of other animals or with the human animal like us. Yeah, when we talk about how I started this, it was basically, yeah, I mean, initially, as I was saying, I didn't see much connection between technology and biology in Romania. But if we think at a global level, the human genome revolution, so the first human genome, the fact that we try to sequence to understand our genome, which is about 3 billion units. It's quite complex. This project started in 1990, was completed in 2003, and it costed about $1 billion. Since then, these days, we can sequence one human genome in under a day and in under $2,000. So this is the leap that we have made in the last
Yeah.
10, 20 years, and it is a revolution. Everything
A-
in terms of
And the
medicine and biology has been revolutionized by our ability to read our genome.
and in your in your view, if you take a leap forward, I wouldn't say more than 5 years, um, the cost is going to drop most likely from 2000 to something,
Yeah,
and
I
the
mean, I said
speed.
2000 because I think the goal was 1000. There was this, at some point, there was this challenge to have a $1000. I think we're getting there. It's just anyway, we're getting into, in other words, when you have a genome that costs a few thousand, what it means is that you can even use personalized genomics. So in other words, the cost of looking at one's genome on the spot to find some problems if he's in hospital, for example. So that's where we're gonna go probably. In countries, of course, that have very developed health systems. Unfortunately, there's lots of inequality in this aspect. But if we think about genomes, we're going towards personalized genomics, where we will be able to, for example, for cancers, um, personalize the treatment depending on the person's genome and on the tumor's genome. And that's something we can do because we can now sequence very fast. And it's the
Yeah.
same with the coronavirus. So we can see this genomic revolution in full bloom in terms of the coronavirus, whereby that would have happened 10 years ago, we would not have known about very quickly about genetic variants or mutations. These days, a genome of the virus, you can just sequence it in an hour, probably in a few hours, and the cost is very low. So that's why we have hundreds of thousands of sequences of the coronavirus, and we can follow its evolution around the world.
Yeah.
So the revolution is everywhere in terms of genomics. Is not in all countries. It's quite unequal. Of course, the access to resources is unequal, but it's something that really happened in the last 20 years, I say.
Yeah. You talked about technology, so I would actually go into one type of technology, which is, or two types, if you want, quantum computing and artificial intelligence. I mean, AI is here, quantum is somewhere in the near or medium future. What is the role of AI in this new revolution? And what do you see some of the, in the next years, some of the things that we'll be able to do, or you will be able to do?
I mean, I know less about AI. I think Google knows more, and the guys there are very interested in AI and others. I think it's interesting when I just think, when I was in Romania back in 99, 2000, I was in high school. I was reading so the Nature Journal, which is basically the most famous academic journal where you publish scientific articles, and it talked then about quantum computer, and I was trying to understand it, and I didn't really understand much about it. And it's funny to talk about this now 20 years later, that actually they're here. And I think it's the same with AI. AI will definitely have a role. So I think in general, when we talk about genomic sequences, there's a lot of information. So we use now, I think one of the best scientists in our field now are mathematicians and informaticians, because we use very heavy bioinformatic and statistical tools to analyze the data. And AI will definitely come into it in terms of treatments as well. I'm not a specialist in AI, but I think,
Okay. Yeah.
for example, AI is, there's a big revolution now in terms of understanding structures of proteins. And so a protein you would have taken before a long time to crystallize a protein and look at it at a very complicated electronic microscope that costs hundreds of thousands of pounds or 1 million, to actually see in detail the structure of molecules in a protein. And I was reading these days that with AI you can now start to predict protein structures from the sequence very fast. So there will be a revolution here as well. But I think if we talk about the future challenges, and I was reading, AI is one of them. You have the environment, and I think genomics is one of them as well. When we talk about how we our ability to manipulate the genes is something there in terms of existential risks and possibilities, and
Yeah.
possibilities.
You mentioned risks, so I would actually go into the sort of the elephant or the rhino in the room, which is related to security and using not just data but transforming, if you like, humans. And it's not just an ethical, but it's also a very complicated geopolitical matter. Um, how do you look at what you can do, ethics and the various types of regulation, be it in China or Russia or the US?
um, I mean, a scientist, a simple scientist, you can just try to do your work honestly and follow the rules, the ethical rules of the place you're doing the science. That's the basic thing you do. Um, of course, the problem is always that different countries will have different ethical rules. I think there's been progress in terms of uniting these rules, but yeah, there's always going to be. I think so far we've seen lots of benefits of the genomic revolution. I don't think so far we've run into big problems, as far as I can see. Um, I'm not someone at the cutting edge of technology. I do more basic human evolution and genetics. I'm interested in our diversity, but I think, as far as I can see so far, we haven't run into huge ethical and existential problems because people have been generally following the rules. But of course, these rules can be changed at some point, and that's a discussion that's ongoing between scientists and policymakers in many countries. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
I think we had some examples where some countries were doing things differently, but as I said, on a whole, I think so far we've seen the benefits mainly. There's one interesting aspect when you talk about, for example, babies. Of course, IVF is an extremely important and useful technique, a valuable one, where people that would not normally be able to have babies will have their babies. So that's amazing. I think these days, for example, in the US, because we now understand much better the genomic architecture or the genetics, so what different genes are doing, I think people can tend now to try to look at different embryos. They have the options not to select, but initially the idea is to select against some very bad diseases. So that's something that's been done. But as we move forward, it's probably gonna be possible to
Yeah.
have some choice when you do IVF in terms of some traits.
Yeah, I have a
Yeah.
scenario that our colleague Kodrin put forward. So let me give you the scenario. Let's say we take a 10-year approach, 2031, right? You're seated in a fertility clinic with Vivaldi playing softly in the background. You and your partner, you brought coffee and a folder. And in the folder, there's an embryo menu. And each embryo has a description, something like, a male, a number 72, no serious diseases, higher than average diabetes expectancy, lower than average risk, dark eyes, brown hair, etc. what do you choose? Are we what is this, how does this scenario sound to you, and do you think we will reach a stage in which we can actually choose most of the traits of
Um,
our future babies?
well, I would hope anyway, ethically, we wouldn't be able to get there to choose most of the traits of our babies. Luckily, biologically, we're not. I mean, we are much more advanced than 50 years ago. So, first of all, you would have, for example, in the UK, in the United Kingdom, uh, when you talk about choosing an embryo and parents, when you do IVF, you do have several embryos, of course, to have one viable. There are very strict regulations, so you can choose one based on things like Down syndrome and some very serious metabolic disorders. So, uh, and these are things where you know a certain gene switch, very simple one that does it. When you talk about complex traits, and most of our traits are complex, you have hundreds of genetic variants that have an influence. So it's important to explain that this when we talk about choosing a baby. Choosing someone's eye color might be possible. Whether ethically a state and scientists will agree with that, I'm not sure. And I don't think there's any value in that personally. But when we talk about diabetes, heart conditions, and other things, things are much more complicated because these are complex traits, and we now have some polygenic scores where we know that each gene adds some risk. But every person is different because every person has different genetic architecture. So there can be another gene that basically overrides the effect of that variant that you know it gives a risk. So, in other words, you can't really establish for sure what the, I mean, you can give some probabilities, but for example, it's difficult because you might say
But can you,
I
yeah,
want to choose this variant that gives me less diabetes, but maybe that one increases the cardiovascular risk. So it's not that simple to actually. So I don't think we're in a scenario where we're going to choose complex traits. I think it's very plausible to choose against some very serious diseases which have a very clear genetic background. But when we talk about complex traits, it's going to be more complicated, both ethically but also technologically, also biologically.
in the same time, what you're saying is that we could reach a stage of tech development that would enable us to eliminate some of these diseases, but the risk is that you would put others on the table.
Well, yeah, I mean, depends on the condition and on the disorder. So, if we, for example, something simple like cystic fibrosis, right? It's a very debilitating condition. It has one genetic variant that we know it's responsible for. That's, let's say you have the technology, and let's say the authorities in the country consider it ethically for parents when to do IVF, that the burden of disease is so hard that they have the right to say we prefer. But it's not about choosing, because when you do IVF, you do have several embryos to have. I mean, that's how you do it. And so, and we don't talk about developed embryos, we talk about the cell stage. So let's say there is a reason to say we prefer not to have, we prefer to screen for cystic fibrosis. But when you talk about complex characters, and most of our traits are complex. So metabolism, immunity, even skin color. Eye color is slightly more simple sometimes, but even skin color that I studied is regulated by about 200-300 genes. Uh, we're not yet in a position to predict exactly a phenotype, a trait from the genetics, and I don't think we'll get that close to be able to say with a certainty. So as parents, then, even if you'd be able to do it, I'm not sure there would be a value to choose in terms of complex traits.
Yeah, but can we predict love? Because I know you have an interest in that as well. Not, or I wouldn't say love, but something that is close to love. Can
Um,
we sort of predict based on genes how people match?
I mean, there is some science behind this, and it's a very interesting one. What we know, and we know from animals, and I think this is and again, we knew this before the genomic revolution, and we were able before to look at individual genes. The difference that, and it's important for our viewers to understand, the difference now is that we can look very fast throughout our genome, as opposed to before it took long to just look at one gene that we were interested in our 3 billion units, in our big sea of genes. In terms of mating, we know from animals and from humans that there is what we call assortative mating or mate choice. And this is probably based sometimes on biology. So, in other words, unconsciously, you might be attracted to someone based on some biological cues. And this is something we know, for example, from seals in Antarctica, that somehow they travel long distances to mate with someone who's more genetically dissimilar than them. They don't know they're genetically dissimilar. They just know they should travel to the other colony. So there is an evolutionary advantage here. In terms of humans, I think there's evidence that our immune genes, it's good to have as much diversity as possible. And some studies have suggested that we are attracted to someone probably based also on some combination of immune genes we have, basically. In other words, we can almost, and we don't know the mechanism yet, but we know we can almost might sniff someone saying there's this immunohistocompatibility genetic
So what you
complex with many
what you
genes that basically
saying?
they're very different between humans, and it's almost that some combinations are give more healthy babies, and it's almost like we would unconsciously feel that. So some
Okay,
studies suggest that.
okay.
Yeah.
So would this mean that you could? So let's take you take a couple, and they're together for 20 years or 10 years. Can you see the probability of their match?
I mean, I wouldn't go that
Or
far. I think what studies have done, for example, were to actually look at the couples and their success and then match that with some biological compatibility they have. So, yeah, you might, I mean, companies have taken that further and they're giving a score in terms of matchmaking. There's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of business to be made out of this. And matchmaking is a big thing in many countries, India, America, Europe. What they have done and what we know is that, for example, when we are giving t-shirts to smell to the other partner and they prefer some of them, they seem to be correlated with a certain combination that we had at some immune genes. So it's almost like we feel whether that leads to a lifelong success is difficult to say because there's psychological factors and others. These are just a few bits of our genome. But what's clear, and that's something I'm actually quite interested because I used to work in India, that there could be some assortative mating. We know that in Europe, in terms of height, there's evidence that basically people assort when they mate. And that could be true for many other traits. Whether
okay.
that leads to a 50-year-long happy marriage, that's a more complicated.
True, especially that marriage in itself is a very social based.
Exactly. So it's difficult to put biology into the social, and I think I'm always cautious when I.
Plus, let's not forget that we do live longer than we used to,
Yes.
as a species, significantly longer. I mean, we have extended our lives, our expectancy, tripled it in the past decades, centuries. Sorry. I have a question about the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years. What are some of the things that really excite you in the genomic world in the next years? What are some of the trends or opportunities that you see and that we should all be also excited about?
I mean, now that the coronavirus pandemic has arrived and it's something that people knew from before, but we've seen it in full bloom with the RNA vaccines, I think the potential of these kind of treatments based on RNA molecules that used to be quite unstable, but now they're basically harnessed and they're put into vaccines. They were used now for the coronavirus, but the people who are working on the RNA on the delivery of RNA molecules into our body are working on this basically for cancer treatments, for immunotherapies. So I think that's and I think they have already several not I'm not sure if several treatments in clinical trials, and that, I think that's going to be a very exciting field. A very exciting few years whereby we'll basically be able probably to use RNA molecules to attack certain tumors. So I think that's going to be probably some Nobel Prizes if once they work. That's one thing. In terms of genomics, I think we're getting now into a personalized medicine paradigm where whereby we can start treating people based on some of their genetic predispositions. I think that's very important and interesting. And when we talk about evolutionary medicine, we talk about reasons for which we have certain diseases today based on how we adapted in the past. So, for example, it seems that we got some genes from the Neanderthals that helped us deal with infections long time ago, but that now predispose us to autoimmune diseases. So that makes our immune system to be more reactive than it should be. So there are reasons for which our systems adapted in the past that today maybe we're maladapted. And I think this evolutionary medicine and the fact that we understand differences between people, and we see that with the coronavirus, I think it's simple because everyone knows about it. So we now know that some people are more protected because of their immune genes, because of some genetic sequences they have. So I think now we're going to be able to see differences between people, why people react differently to medicines, to treatments, why people, and I think that's going to be quite exciting as well.
Yeah. And what scares you, or what excites you on the other side, if you like?
I think personally, I'm not worried, but I'm aware that this idea of choosing babies as we know more, as we understand more about our genetic architecture, and especially when we talk about cognitive abilities, I think that's something that I don't appreciate too much personally. Also, because I don't think we can predict our cognitive abilities based on solely on genetics. But I think the idea and marketing is something very useful, but I think it's important to think how you market genomics. And I think if you market it in terms of choosing traits, it's not something that I not why I do science in a way. But there are, as I said, there are many opportunities, but there are opportunities in terms of understanding our genomics, genetic differences, also in terms of mental conditions. I think we're now getting into a place where we understand more in terms of the genetics of it, and we can think about treatments. So as we move forward, there's going to be these new treatments based on differences in our genes. And we already see, I think, and the last thing you asked me what excites me, I forgot, is like genetic therapy. So the fact that now, even for rare conditions, it seems we can start dealing with that. So adding to our cells the gene that is missing, basically. And they've started doing these kind of studies, even for conditions where there's only a few babies that have something. And I think as we understand more our genomics, as our genetic architecture, but also the technology, the way to introduce a certain gene, we're gonna be able to treat more conditions, and that's gonna be very exciting.
Yeah. I would, because this is the Future Summit, I have an exercise about the future for you. So let's take a really complicated timeline and let's go to 2050. 2050 is a long time from now, but in the same time, 30 years is not that big of a deal. I mean,
Yeah.
we both remember the 90s, so
Yes.
it's like yesterday. If you would go 30 years into the future, having give you, quantum computing, 6G, uh, advanced AI, et cetera, et cetera. So tech that accelerates. What are some of the things in that distant future that you think would happen that now seem almost impossible?
Thinking about the future is difficult. So as we'll understand more about our genomics, our genetic makeup, basically, we'll know about this in many populations. So we'll find out many more things than we know now about differences between populations. I think that's just going to lead to better ways to treat all sorts of conditions. So we'll understand our nervous system better, our immune system. I think we're just at the beginning where we're understanding our immunity. That's very complicated. So I think with lots of technology, plus being able to understand the genetic makeup, the biological architecture, we'll be in a place quite a science fiction one. I mean, compared to today, I mean, things are moving very fast in terms of how should I say that? In terms of how we see our bodies and how we see our what I would hope to happen in 30 years would be there to be more education and a wider reach towards the ideas of genetic differences between people and biology in general. I would hope that in 30 years the idea of genetics will be more. So, for example, hopefully, even our home country of Romania, people will have a basic education in that, and hopefully, in 30 years, when we'll have another pandemic, people will just get a vaccine. That's something I would see in 30 years, almost a science fiction thing.
But speaking of science fiction, is 2050 a world without disease? Is that a possibility that you see having in view
I,
tech advancement?
I mean, I'm not a medic, first of all. I'm just a scientist, simple scientist. I don't think there's going to be a world without diseases, unfortunately. But I do think we can improve some of the current diseases with AI, new technologies, and with lots of scientific. I mean, just the fact that we developed an RNA vaccine for a virus in 1 year suggests that we'll be able to have some very personalized treatments that prime our immune system to deal with all sorts of pathologies. I think that's going to be a realistic thing. So in other words, not like in those movies where you have robots, but really to have a profile of someone genetically and to be able to address some problems in a very holistic way, uh, based on their biology, and on our knowledge. I think that's a possibility. So these days we're at the beginning, and again, I need to talk because coronavirus is simple. So why some people react very differently? We now understand some of the biological mechanisms, the immunity behind that. But I think in 30 years we'll be able to know much more precisely why people get all sorts of conditions based on their immune. I think the immune system is something very important, and whenever even some cancers are probably due to some infections initially. So I think the way our immune system reacts, and genetic differences between different people in terms of immunity will be able to have a very fine detail of that and address it in a personalized way. I
Yeah,
think that's going
lovely.
to happen in 30 years.
And the last question is: we talked about the future, but I think we also need to talk about the past. Uh, would you recommend people to do a DNA test that looks at ancestry, traits? What's your take on this?
I mean, sure. Once I open my company, they're welcome to do it. These days, it's not forced. I'm joking. Um, why not if they're interested? I don't think the test is gonna tell them anything that exciting because they know who they are. If they're confident with who they are, they should be confident anyway with who they are, where they are. But it is interesting to maybe see that you have some ancestry from a place you didn't know of. I think what I always say is people should be cautious when if they ask for genetic for data in terms of their genetic susceptibility to different diseases. I think they should take that with a pinch of salt. I don't think because that's a statistical probability, and I think sometimes it's not well explained. It's not. You shouldn't do a test and look at your genome and then have some scores and think, oh, I'm gonna have heart disease or I'm gonna have. There is a benefit. If you think you have susceptibility to heart disease, maybe you're gonna drink less or not smoke. So I can see the benefit, but I don't think they should read too much into what diseases am I gonna have in the future. In terms of the past, it's always I like the past. I like thinking about history. That's why I do evolution and genetics. So it's always interesting to know where we're from, and it's exciting. So if people are curious about it, why not? It just might not tell them something that exciting.
Yeah, but in the same time, it might open their minds
Yes,
also to the fact that diversity is natural.
I think the benefit of this indeed is to understand that when you look at the genetic profile of someone, we're all pretty similar: Africans, European, Asians, Australians. So we should look at this in terms of similarities, and probably there are some differences. But it would be exciting to find out actually that you're probably more similar. You do a test in Europe, and you might find yourself more similar to someone in Asia than in Europe. So that makes us think in terms of identities and the fact that we're all very mixed.
Now, speaking about identities and where we come from, I'm super excited to tell you that from the next session starts at 4 Romanian or Bucharest time. And we have Cornel Amarie, who's a Romanian inventor with Lumen, and Dimitris Lampros from Swim. Dimitris in Greece is developing a headset that supports blind swimmers to actually swim properly. And why I say this about Greece is that I recently took an ancestry and traits test. And I didn't really find out something new, but I really enjoyed understanding more about genes, my own genes, and what this means. And I knew I'm part Greek, but now I have data to show it as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you have some data to back up. But yeah, it's important if you think about your identity, as long as you're comfortable with it. And as you say, it enhances your imagination and makes you think about history. And in a way, it's an education tool, as long as it's used properly.
Cool.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you so much. We had Mircea Iliescu, who's a geneticist at the University of Cambridge.
So nice.
We have a lot more sessions to cover today besides what happens from 4. Don't forget, from 6:30 we switch to Romanian, and we have a conversation about sustainable business making, and then from 7:30 we talk about sustainable finance, and where the world is heading from this perspective. Thank you again, Mircea. Have a lovely day, everyone.
All the
And
best.
take care of your genes. They're quite important.
Yes, we will.